Good evening all, and welcome back to Untold Fears. Tonight I have 10 bone-chilling stories from the most isolated corners of Alaska, where remote cabins hide secrets darker than the endless winter nights. These are not campfire tales. These are real accounts from people who ventured into the Alaskan wilderness and encountered things that defy explanation. From phantom lights circling frozen lakes to strangers who watch you sleep. From voices speaking through dead radios to entities that count down your final moments. If you are new here, make sure to subscribe to Untold Fears for daily true horror content that will keep you up at night. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the darkness calls. Now let us step into the shadows of the Alaskan wilderness, where civilization ends and terror begins. This happened in late November of last year when I agreed to house-sit a remote cabin for a friend of a friend outside Fairbanks. The owner, an older man named Gerald, needed someone to watch the place for 10 days while he visited family in Anchorage for Thanksgiving. He offered me $200 and said I could use the cabin however I wanted. It seemed like easy money, and I thought the solitude would be nice. I had no idea what I was agreeing to. The cabin sat about 40 miles northeast of Fairbanks, accessible only by a narrow dirt road that turned to ice and snow this time of year. Gerald drove me out there himself on a gray afternoon when the temperature hovered around -30 degrees. The landscape was brutal. Endless stretches of black spruce and white birch frozen solid, with mountains looming in the distance like teeth. The sky stayed dim even at noon, that peculiar Alaskan winter twilight that makes you feel like the sun has given up entirely. The cabin itself was small but well built. Thick log walls, a metal roof weighted down with snow, double-paned windows that rattled when the wind picked up. Inside, it was a single large room with a wood stove, a kitchen area, a couch, and a bed in the corner. There was a smaller back room for storage and a primitive bathroom with a composting toilet. No running water. No electricity except for a small solar setup that powered a few lights and could charge my phone, though there was no cell service out here. The nearest neighbor, Gerald said, was about 8 miles south. He pointed vaguely in that direction, but I saw nothing but trees. Gerald showed me how to work the wood stove, where the firewood was stacked outside, and how to melt snow for water. He seemed nervous, talking quickly, avoiding eye contact. Before he left, he paused at the door and said something I did not think much about at the time. He said the cabin gets noisy at night, that the wood settles and the wind plays tricks. He told me not to worry about it. Then he drove away, and I watched his truck disappear down the frozen road until the trees swallowed it completely. The first night was fine. I made dinner on the propane stove, read a book by lamplight, and fell asleep to the crackling of the fire. I woke up once around 2 in the morning to add more wood, then went back to sleep. No problems. The second night was when it started. I woke suddenly at 2:47 in the morning. I know the exact time because I checked my phone, confused about what had pulled me from sleep. The fire had died down to embers, and the cabin was freezing. My breath came out in clouds. Then I heard it. 3 knocks. Deliberate, evenly spaced, coming from the back door. Knock. 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 I sat up in bed, my heart already pounding. The knocks were not frantic or hurried. They were patient, measured. I waited, listening. Nothing. Just the wind moving through the trees outside, a low moan that never seemed to stop. I told myself it was a branch, maybe snow sliding off the roof. But deep down, I knew those knocks were too precise, too intentional. I got out of bed and walked slowly toward the back door, my footsteps creaking on the wooden floor. The door was solid wood with no window, just a simple latch lock. I stood there for a long moment, my hand hovering over the latch. Then I pressed my ear to the door and listened. Silence. Complete, suffocating silence. I did not open it. Instead, I went to the nearest window and looked out into the night. The moon was nearly full, casting blue light across the snow. I could see the clearing around the cabin, the woodpile, the outhouse about 30 feet away. Nothing moved. No tracks in the snow, No animals, no people. I checked every window, circling the cabin, searching for any sign of what could have made that sound. There was nothing. I went back to bed but did not sleep. I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to every creak and groan of the cabin, waiting for those knocks to come again. They did not that night. The next night, I went to bed anxious, half expecting it. And at 2:47 in the morning, I woke to the same 3 knocks. This time, they came from the front door. Knock, knock, knock. Same rhythm, same deliberate spacing. I did not get up. I stayed in bed, frozen, listening. After about 30 seconds, the knocks came again. Still the front door. Knock, knock, knock. This time, I forced myself out of bed. I grabbed the flashlight Gerald had left on the counter and went to the front door. I stood there, flashlight in one hand, the other on the door latch. I wanted to open it. Part of me needed to see what was out there, to prove to myself it was just an animal or the wind or my imagination, but I could not do it. Something primal in my brain screamed at me not to open that door. Instead, I shouted through the wood. I said, "Who is out there?" My voice sounded thin and weak in the cold air. No response. I waited a full minute, then slowly unlatched the door and pulled it open. Flashlight raised. Nothing. Fresh snow had fallen that evening, covering the ground in a smooth, unbroken blanket. No footprints. No tracks of any kind. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating trees and snow and nothing else. I stepped out onto the porch, the cold biting through my thermal layers immediately. I swept the flashlight in a wide arc, checking every direction. Empty. Completely empty. I went back inside and locked the door. I did not sleep again that night. The pattern continued. Every night, at exactly 2:47 in the morning, 3 knocks. They moved around the cabin. 3rd night, the west window. 4th night, the east window. 5th night, they came from the back storage room. Each time I checked. Each time, nothing. No tracks. No signs of disturbance. Just those 3 deliberate knocks, like something was circling the cabin, testing it. By the 5th night, I was barely sleeping. I would lie awake, watching the clock on my phone, waiting for 2:47. My nerves were shredded. I started keeping the fire going all night, burning through Gerald's firewood at an unsustainable rate because the darkness felt worse than the cold. That 5th night, the knocking changed. At 2:47, I heard the 3 knocks, but they were not coming from a door or window. They were coming from below me, from underneath the cabin. I sat up in bed, my whole body going rigid. Knock, 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 directly beneath where I was sitting. Then I heard something else, a scraping sound, wood against wood. I got out of bed slowly and looked around the cabin floor. That is when I noticed it for the first time. In the back corner of the main room, partially hidden under a rug, there was a trapdoor. A small wooden hatch, maybe 2 feet square, with an iron ring handle. I'd been in this cabin for 5 days and never noticed it. Gerald never mentioned it. I pulled the rug aside completely, exposing the trapdoor, and crouched down next to it. The scraping sound came again, louder now. Something was moving in the crawlspace beneath the cabin. Then the knocking started again, right below the trapdoor. Knock, knock, knock. Each knock made the wood vibrate under my hand. Whatever was down there was close, right on the other side of the wood. I should have left the cabin right then. I should have grabbed my things and walked the 40 miles back to the main road in the freezing darkness. But I did not. Instead, I stood up, backed away from the trapdoor, and spent the rest of the night sitting on the couch with a knife in my hand, watching that hatch, waiting for it to open. It never did. When dawn came, gray and weak through the windows, the sound stopped. I spent the daylight hours searching the outside of the cabin for an entrance to the crawlspace. I found it on the north side, a small wooden panel about 18 inches square, partially buried in snow. It was latched from the outside, locked. Whatever was under there could not have gotten in or out through that panel, but something had been down there. I heard it. I did not know what to do. I had no way to contact Gerald, no phone service, no neighbors close enough to reach on foot in this cold. I had 5 more days to go, 5 more nights. I considered leaving, but the idea of walking 40 miles through the wilderness in negative 30-degree weather in the dark felt more dangerous than staying. That night, I did not sleep at all. I sat on the couch, fully dressed, boots on, knife within reach, flashlight in hand. 2:47 came and went, no knocks, nothing. The silence was worse than the sound. At 3:15, exhausted and confused, I finally dozed off. I woke at dawn to find every cabinet door in the kitchen hanging open. I had closed them before sitting down. I know I did. They were open, now, all of them, like something had methodically gone through and opened each one during the few hours I slept. I made it through 3 more nights. The knocking continued, always at 2:47, always moving around the cabin, sometimes from the crawl space, sometimes from outside. On the 8th night, I found muddy streaks on the inside of the back window, like something with wet, dirty hands had pressed against the glass from the inside. But I was alone in the cabin. I had been alone the entire time. When Gerald came to pick me up on the 10th day, I was waiting outside with my bag, even though it was 20 below zero. I did not want to spend 1 more second inside that cabin. He took one look at me and knew. He did not ask questions. On the drive back, about halfway to Fairbanks, he finally spoke. He said the cabin was built on old trapping grounds. Trappers used to disappear out here in the 1800s, just vanish into the woods. He said people reported strange things, knocking, voices, shadows. He said he had experienced it too, but thought it would stop if he ignored it. It did not stop. I looked at him and asked why he sent me out there if he knew. He did not have an answer. He just stared at the road and said he needed to visit his family, that was all. I never went back to that cabin. I still think about those knocks sometimes, the perfect rhythm, the way they circled the cabin like something was pacing, waiting. I do not know what was out there. I do not know what was underneath. But I know it was not the wind. It was not the cabin settling, and it is still out there, knocking, waiting for the next person foolish enough to stay. I rented a cabin near Denali National Park last September for what was supposed to be a peaceful solo writing retreat. I am a freelance writer, and I had a manuscript deadline approaching fast. I needed isolation, no distractions, just me and my laptop for 2 weeks. The cabin listing looked perfect. Remote, affordable, surrounded by wilderness, with basic amenities and decent solar power for my electronics. The owner, a woman named Sandra, seemed friendly over email. She said the cabin was about 18 miles from the nearest town, accessible by a rough dirt road, and that I would have complete privacy. That last part turned out to be a lie. The drive up was beautiful. Early September in Alaska is stunning. The leaves turning gold and red, the air crisp and clean, mountains towering in every direction. I stopped in the small town of Healy to stock up on groceries, enough food for 2 weeks, then followed Sandra's directions down a winding forest road that got progressively narrower and rougher. The cabin appeared after about 40 minutes of driving, a small A-frame structure tucked into a clearing, surrounded by dense spruce forest. It looked exactly like the photos, cozy, isolated, perfect. Inside, the cabin was simple but comfortable. 1 main room with a kitchenette, a wood stove, a desk by the window, and a loft bedroom accessible by a wooden ladder. The bathroom was tiny but functional, with a propane-powered tankless water heater for hot showers. There was no Wi-Fi, which I expected, but I had downloaded everything I needed and had cell service, though it was weak and unreliable. I unpacked, made dinner, and spent the evening organizing my notes. I went to bed that first night feeling optimistic and relaxed. The first week was exactly what I needed. I fell into a good routine. Wake up early, make coffee, write until noon, take a hike, write some more, make dinner, read, sleep. The silence was incredible. No traffic, no neighbors, just wind in the trees and the occasional bird call. I made excellent progress on my manuscript. By day 7, I was ahead of schedule and feeling great. That night, everything changed. I woke up around 3 in the morning to a sound I could not immediately identify. A creaking, rhythmic and slow, like someone walking carefully across wooden boards. I lay there in the loft, disoriented and groggy, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. Then I realized it was coming from outside, from the porch directly below my bedroom window. I sat up slowly, my heart starting to pound. The creaking stopped. I waited, listening hard, but heard nothing except the wind. I told myself it was an animal. A moose, maybe. They wander through this area all the time, but the sound had been too deliberate, too measured. It sounded like footsteps. I climbed down from the loft as quietly as I could and went to the front window. The moon was bright enough to illuminate the clearing around, the cabin. I scanned the area carefully. Nothing. No animals, no movement. I checked the door. Locked. I looked out the side windows. Empty. I felt foolish, standing there in my pajamas, convinced I had been woken by a moose or a dream. I went back to bed but did not sleep well. I kept waking up, listening, expecting to hear that creaking sound again. It did not come. The next morning, I went outside to split some firewood. That is when I saw them. Footprints. Boot prints in the dirt near the porch, right below the loft window. Large prints, definitely human, with a distinctive tread pattern. They led from the tree line to the porch, then back toward the trees on the other side of the cabin. Someone had been there. Someone had been walking around the cabin while I slept. My stomach dropped. I followed the prints to the side of the cabin and felt my blood go cold. The prints stopped directly beneath the small window of the loft bedroom. My bedroom. There were scuff marks in the dirt, like someone had stood there for a while, shifting their weight. I looked up at the window. From that position, anyone standing there would have a clear view of my bed. I went back inside and locked the door, my hands shaking. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was Sandra checking on the property. Maybe it was a hunter passing through. But why would they approach the cabin at 3 in the morning and stand outside my window? Why not knock on the door? The more I thought about it, the more wrong it felt. I spent the rest of the day on edge, jumping at every sound. I considered leaving, but I had already paid for 2 weeks and made such good progress on my manuscript. I decided to stay, but to be more careful. I would lock everything, keep my phone nearby, and sleep with a flashlight and a knife within reach. That night, I barely slept. I lay in the loft, staring at the ceiling, listening. Around 2 in the morning, I heard it again. Creaking. Footsteps on the porch. This time, I was ready. I grabbed my flashlight and phone, climbed down from the loft silently, and crept to the window. I stayed low, out of sight, and slowly peered out. I saw him. A man standing at the edge of the porch, maybe 15 feet from where I crouched. He was just standing there, facing the cabin, completely still. He wore dark clothing, a jacket and jeans, and a baseball cap pulled low. I could not see his face. He did not move. He just stood there, watching the cabin. My heart was hammering so hard I thought he might hear it. I ducked back down, my mind racing. Should I yell at him, call 911? But I had almost no cell signal, and I was 18 miles from the nearest town. Even if I got through, how long would it take for someone to reach me? I decided to wait. Maybe he would leave. I stayed crouched below the window, listening. After what felt like an eternity, I heard the footsteps again, creaking across the porch, then fading into the distance. I waited another 10 minutes before I dared to look out again. He was gone. I did not sleep at all that night. At first light, I went outside to check. More footprints. The same boot prints all around the cabin. He had circled the entire structure. I followed the prints to the back of the cabin and found something that made me feel sick. The print stopped at the back door, not just near it, right at it. And there were scratches around the doorknob, fresh scratches in the metal, like someone had been trying to pick the lock or force it open. That was it. I packed my things and drove straight to Healy. I went to the ranger station and filed a report. The ranger, a middle-aged man named Tom, listened carefully and did not seem surprised. He asked me for Sandra's name and the location of the cabin. Then he told me something that made my blood run cold. I was not the first person to report this. Another renter, a woman, had stayed at that same cabin 2 months earlier. She reported the same thing. Footsteps at night. Someone watching the cabin, boot prints outside her bedroom window. She had also found food missing from her supplies. Items moved around inside the cabin while she was out hiking. She filed a police report, but they never found anyone. Tom said there had been other incidents in the area over the past year. Break-ins at remote cabins and rentals. A man with a history of trespassing and voyeurism was suspected, but he had never been caught. The working theory was that he was watching these properties, learning the routines of whoever was staying there, and entering when they were away or asleep. In at least 2 cases, women had woken up to find him inside their cabins, just standing there, watching them sleep. I felt nauseous. Tom asked if I wanted to press charges or if I wanted them to investigate the cabin. I said yes to both. He said he would contact the state troopers and have them check it out. He also said I should contact Sandra and let her know. I called her immediately. Sandra was horrified. She said she had no idea anyone had been coming around the property. She said she would install security cameras and better locks. She offered me a full refund and apologized repeatedly. But here is the thing. When I described the boot prints to Tom, he asked me to take photos and send them to him. I did. Later that day, he called me back. The tread pattern matched prints found at 2 other cabins in the area. Different properties, different owners, but the same trespasser. They believed it was the same man, and he had been doing this for at least a year, possibly longer. He was targeting solo renters, especially women, at remote properties. He would watch them, learn their routines, and eventually break in. In one case, he had been living in the crawlspace beneath a cabin for 3 days before the renter discovered him. The state troopers searched Sandra's cabin a few days later. They found evidence that someone had been entering the cabin regularly. The spare key, which Sandra kept hidden under a rock near the shed, was missing. They found fresh scratches on the lock of the back door. And they found something else. In the small storage shed about 50 feet from the cabin, behind some old equipment, they found a sleeping bag, some food wrappers, and a notebook. The notebook had dates and times written in it. My dates. The dates I had been staying at the cabin. There were notes about my routine, what time I woke up, when I went hiking, what I ate for dinner. Someone had been watching me the entire time. They had been documenting my every move. They also found photos. Polaroid photos of me through the cabin windows. Me sitting at the desk writing. Me cooking dinner. Me asleep in the loft. My face was clearly visible in some of them. I felt violated in a way I cannot even describe. The troopers told me they believed the man had been staying in the shed, watching the cabin, and entering when I was out hiking or asleep. They think he had been planning to escalate. The scratches on the back door were fresh from the night I saw him on the porch. He had been trying to get inside. They never caught him. He disappeared after I left. The troopers set up surveillance on the property for 2 weeks, but he never came back. They think he realized I had reported him and moved on to another location. They warned other cabin owners in the area, but there are hundreds of remote rentals scattered across thousands of square miles. He could be anywhere. I finished my manuscript at home. I cannot stay in remote places anymore. Even the idea of being alone in a cabin makes my skin crawl. I keep thinking about those Polaroids, about someone standing outside my window in the middle of the night, watching me sleep, planning God knows what. Sandra installed cameras and changed all the locks. She said she is considering selling the property. The troopers told me they are still looking for him, but I'm not holding my breath. He is out there somewhere, watching another cabin, another solo traveler documenting their routine, waiting for the right moment. I still have nightmares about it. I wake up in my own bed, in my locked apartment, and I swear I hear footsteps. I checked the windows obsessively. I installed extra locks on my doors. My therapist says it will get better with time, but I do not know. Some things change you. Some fears do not go away. And knowing he is still out there, still doing this to other people, makes it so much worse. I worked as a winter caretaker for an abandoned fishing lodge in central Alaska during the winter of 2023. The job posting had been up for months with no takers, which should have been my first warning sign. The pay was decent, $1,500 a week, plus room and board, for a 6-week contract from mid-November to early January. My job was simple: stay at the lodge, check on the 8 guest cabins every day, keep the generators running, make sure pipes did not freeze, and document any damage from weather or wildlife. The lodge had been closed for 3 years, sitting empty through brutal winters, slowly falling apart. The owner wanted to sell it, but needed someone to maintain it through one more season. I drove up in mid-November on a gray afternoon when the temperature was already 10 below zero. The lodge sat on the shore of a remote lake, about 60 miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a seasonal road that would be impassable once heavy snow hit. The main lodge building was 2 stories, with a commercial kitchen, a large dining hall, and living quarters upstairs. Surrounding it in a semicircle were 8 identical guest cabins, each about 20 feet from the next, all facing the frozen lake. They were numbered 1 through 8, small wooden structures with single rooms, bunk beds, and wood stoves. The owner, a man named Richard, met me there to show me around and hand over the keys. He seemed rushed, eager to leave before dark. He showed me the generator shed, the propane storage, and the main lodge. He did not take me inside any of the guest cabins. He just pointed at them and said they were all empty, all unlocked, and that I should check them daily for any issues. He gave me a satellite phone for emergencies, wished me luck, and left. I watched his truck disappear down the snowy road, and then I was alone. The first week was fine. I settled into a routine. Every morning, I would bundle up and make the rounds checking each cabin. I would open the door, look inside, make sure nothing was broken or frozen, then move to the next one. The cabins were all in rough shape, dusty, cold, furniture covered in old sheets. Some had animal droppings, evidence of mice or squirrels getting in through gaps in the walls. Cabin 6 was in the middle of the row, unremarkable compared to the others. It was on the 8th day that I noticed something odd. I made my morning rounds as usual, starting with cabin 1 and working my way down the line. When I reached cabin 6, the door was standing open, not just unlocked, open, wide open, swinging slightly in the wind. I stopped and stared at it. I had checked cabin 6 the day before, and I had closed the door. I was certain of it. I always closed the doors. I walked up to the cabin slowly and peered inside. Everything looked normal. The furniture was where it had always been, covered in sheets. Nothing disturbed. I checked the door latch. It was not broken. The door had simply been opened from the inside or outside. I assumed the wind had blown it open. Maybe the latch had not caught properly. I closed it firmly, made sure it latched, and moved on. The next day, cabin 6 was open again. Same thing. Door standing wide open, swinging in the wind. I felt a flicker of unease, but told myself it had to be the latch. Maybe it was broken in a way I had not noticed. I went inside and tested it several times. It seemed fine. It clicked shut and held. I closed the door again, this time jamming a piece of wood against it from the outside to keep it shut. Day 10. The wood was on the ground and the door was open. That was when I started to feel genuinely disturbed. There was no wind strong enough to blow that wood out of place. I went inside cabin 6 and looked around more carefully. That is when I noticed the chair. There was a single wooden chair in the corner, and it had been moved. I was sure it had been against the wall under the window, but now it was in the center of the room facing the door, facing me. I stared at it for a long time. I tried to remember if it had always been there, in the center of the room, but I was certain it had not. I had been in this cabin every day for over a week. I picked up the chair and moved it back to the corner, pushing it firmly against the wall. Then I left, closing the door behind me, my heart beating faster than it should have been. Day 11. The chair was outside, sitting on the porch of cabin 6 and facing the lake. I stood there in the snow staring at it, my breath coming out in clouds. There was no rational explanation. No wind could have moved that chair outside. No animal could have done it. I walked up to the porch, picked up the chair, and looked at it closely. It was just a chair. Old, wooden, nothing special. I brought it inside, set it back in the corner, and closed the door. I did not jam it with wood this time. I wanted to see what would happen. That night, I could not sleep. I lay in my bed in the main lodge, staring at the ceiling, thinking about that chair. Around 2 a.m, I got up, put on my boots and coat, grabbed a flashlight, and walked out to cabin 6. The door was closed. I opened it slowly and shone my flashlight inside. The chair was gone. Completely gone. Not in the corner, not in the center of the room, not on the porch. Gone. I searched the entire cabin, looked under the bed, in the corners behind the door. Nothing. I stepped outside and swept my flashlight across the clearing. That is when I saw it. The chair was sitting in the snow, about 50 feet from the cabin, directly between cabin 6 and the frozen lake. Just sitting there, upright, as if someone had carefully placed it. I walked over to it, my boots crunching in the snow, and stood there, staring at it. There were no footprints around it. None. The snow was smooth and undisturbed except for my own tracks leading from the lodge. I picked up the chair and carried it back to cabin 6. I put it inside, closed the door, and went back to the lodge. I did not sleep the rest of that night. The next morning, I called the owner on the satellite phone. I told him what was happening. He was silent for a long time. Then he said, "Just stay out of cabin 6. Do not go in there anymore. Check the other cabins, but leave that one alone." I asked him why. He said he would explain later and hung up. I followed his advice. For 3 days, I avoided cabin 6 entirely. I checked the other 7 cabins, did my work, and tried not to think about it. But I could see cabin 6 from the lodge windows, and every time I looked, something was different. One day, the door was open. The next day, it was closed. One morning, I saw the chair on the porch again. I did not go near it. On day 15, a second caretaker arrived. Richard had hired him without telling me. Said he thought I could use the company and the help. His name was Ethan, a guy in his 30s, who had done caretaker work before. He seemed friendly and competent. I was relieved to have someone else there. I told him about cabin 6. He laughed it off, said I had probably been seeing things. That isolation does weird things to your head. That night, we both saw it. We were in the dining hall playing cards when we heard a sound outside. A scraping sound, like wood dragging across wood. We went to the window and looked out. It was dark, but the moon was bright enough to see. Every single piece of furniture from all 8 cabins was outside. Beds, chairs, tables, all arranged in the snow between the cabins and the lake. Not scattered. Arranged. In neat rows. Like someone had spent hours carefully organizing them. Ethan went pale. We both stood there, staring, unable to speak. Then we heard the knocking. It started at cabin 1, 3 loud knocks, then moved to cabin 2, then cabin 3, working its way down the line. Knock, knock, knock. Each cabin in sequence. When it reached cabin 6, the knocking stopped. We waited, barely breathing. Then all the furniture outside started to shake, not violently, just a slight trembling, like something was moving underneath it. We ran back to the main lodge and locked the doors. Ethan called Richard immediately on the satellite phone, told him what we saw. Richard did not sound surprised. He told us to pack our things and leave first thing in the morning, that he would pay us for the full contract. He said the lodge was cursed, that something had happened there years ago, and that he should never have sent anyone out there alone. We left at dawn. We did not check the cabins. We did not look back. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. All the furniture was back inside the cabins. I could see it through the windows, every piece back where it belonged. Later, I did some research. I found old newspaper articles about the lodge. In 1962, a fishing party of 6 men had come to stay there. They went out on the lake one morning and never came back. Their boat was found empty, drifting near the far shore. No bodies were ever recovered. The last cabin they had stayed in was Cabin 6. The lodge was sold the following year. Richard never found a buyer willing to keep it. It was demolished in 2024. I heard that the crew working the demolition refused to touch Cabin 6. They tore down the other 7 cabins in the main lodge, but they left Cabin 6 standing. Last I heard, it is still out there, alone on the shore of that frozen lake, door standing open, waiting. My girlfriend and I decided to rent a cabin near the Kenai Peninsula for Valentine's Day weekend last year. We both needed a break from the city, and the idea of a romantic getaway in the Alaskan wilderness sounded perfect. The cabin listing looked incredible. Rustic but modern, fully stocked kitchen, a massive stone fireplace, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a frozen river, and complete isolation. The nearest town was 30 miles away, and the owner promised we would have total privacy. It was exactly what we wanted, or so we thought. We left Anchorage on Friday afternoon, February 12th. The drive was beautiful at first, winding through snow-covered forests, mountains rising in the distance. But as we got farther from civilization, the road deteriorated. Paved turned to gravel, gravel turned to dirt, and eventually we were following tire tracks through deep snow on what barely qualified as a road. My girlfriend, Sarah, started getting nervous. She kept asking if I was sure this was the right way. I checked the GPS coordinates the owner had sent. We were going the right direction. We arrived just before sunset, around 5:30. The cabin was stunning, bigger than I expected, 2 stories, with a wraparound porch, and smoke already rising from the chimney. The owner had come out earlier to start a fire for us and leave supplies. There was a note on the kitchen counter welcoming us, along with a bottle of wine and some local chocolates. Everything seemed perfect. We unpacked, opened the wine, and spent the evening cooking dinner together. The cabin was warm and cozy, the fireplace roaring, candles lit on the dining table. We ate, talked, laughed, and eventually went to bed around midnight. The bedroom was upstairs, a loft-style space with huge windows overlooking the river and forest. Sarah fell asleep almost immediately. I lay there for a while, listening to the silence. It was so quiet out there. No traffic, no neighbors, no sounds at all except the occasional creak of the cabin settling and the wind outside. I woke up sometime in the early morning. The room was pitch black. The fire downstairs had died, and the temperature had dropped significantly. I could see my breath. I reached for my phone to check the time. 3:17 a.m. I was about to roll over and go back to sleep when I heard something, a soft sound, like a door closing, downstairs. I lay there, perfectly still, listening. Sarah was asleep next to me, breathing softly. I told myself I had imagined it. Old cabins make noises, but then I heard it again, footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps on the wooden floor below us. Someone was in the cabin. My heart started pounding. I sat up slowly, careful not to wake Sarah. The footsteps continued. They were moving through the main room, toward the kitchen, then stopping. I could hear the floorboards creaking directly below our bedroom. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight, then climbed. Out of bed as quietly as I could, I crept to the top of the stairs and looked down. I could not see anyone. The main room was dark, the fireplace just glowing embers, but I could hear breathing. Someone was down there, standing in the darkness, breathing. I should have called 911 right then. I should have woken Sarah and barricaded the door, but instead I shouted. I yelled, "Who is down there? Get out of my cabin." The breathing stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound. I stood at the top of the stairs, shining my flashlight down into the darkness, waiting. Nothing, no response, no movement. Then I heard the back door open and close, footsteps on the porch, then silence. I ran downstairs, turned on every light, and checked the entire cabin. The back door was unlocked. I was certain we had locked it before bed. I checked every room, every closet, under the beds. No one was there, but someone had been. I could feel it. The air felt wrong, disturbed, like someone had just passed through. Sarah woke up to the sound of me moving around downstairs. She came down, confused and scared, asking what was going on. I told her someone had been in the cabin. She did not believe me at first. She thought I had a nightmare. But then I showed her the back door, still unlocked, and the muddy footprints on the floor. Large boot prints, wet and dirty, tracking through the kitchen and stopping at the base of the stairs that led to our bedroom. We both stood there, staring at those prints. They had not been there when we went to bed. Someone had been inside the cabin while we slept. Someone had walked right up to the stairs and stood there, listening to us, watching us. Sarah started crying. She wanted to leave immediately. But it was 3:30 in the morning, 30 miles from the nearest town, and a snowstorm had started while we slept. The wind was howling, and I could see snow swirling in the beam of the porch light. Driving in those conditions, on that road, in the dark, felt more dangerous than staying. I convinced her we would be safe if we locked all the doors and windows, moved furniture in front of the doors, and stayed awake until morning. We spent the next 3 hours sitting on the couch, every light in the cabin turned on, staring at the doors and windows. Sarah kept asking who would be out here. Why would someone break in? I did not have answers. At first light, around 7 a.m., we decided to investigate outside before we left. I wanted to see if there were footprints, if I could figure out where this person had come from or gone. We bundled up and went outside. The storm had stopped, leaving about 6 inches of fresh snow. We walked around the cabin slowly, looking for tracks. That is when Sarah grabbed my arm and pointed. On the north side of the cabin, there was a small window, about chest height, leading into the basement. The window was open. Not broken, open, like someone had unlatched it from the inside. I knelt down and looked at the ground beneath the window. There were footprints in the snow, lots of them. Some coming toward the cabin, some leading away, but some just circling the area like someone had been pacing back and forth. And then I saw something that made my stomach turn. There was a sleeping bag wedged between the cabin and a woodpile. A dirty, worn sleeping bag, along with some food wrappers, a water bottle, and a flashlight. Someone had been living there, under our cabin, in the crawl space. I crawled closer and shone my flashlight through the open window into the basement. I could see more evidence: a backpack, some clothes, a camping stove. Whoever this person was, they had set up camp under the cabin. They had been there when we arrived. They had been there the entire time. Sarah was hysterical. She ran back to the front of the cabin, screaming at me to get in the car. I grabbed my phone and took photos of everything: the footprints, the sleeping bag, the open window. Then I followed her to the car. We threw our bags in, started the engine, and began driving down the snowy road toward town. The drive took over an hour. The road was terrible, covered in snow, barely visible. But we did not stop. We drove straight to the state trooper station in Soldotna and filed a report. The trooper who took our statement did not seem surprised. He asked for the address of the cabin, and when I gave it to him, he nodded slowly and said they had received reports about that property before. He told us that over the past 2 years, there had been multiple complaints from renters at that cabin. People hearing noises at night, doors unlocking themselves, items going missing, food being eaten. One couple had reported waking up to find a man standing at the foot of their bed, just staring at them. By the time they turned on the lights, he was gone. The troopers had investigated but never found anyone. The owner claimed to know nothing about it. The troopers said they suspected someone was using the cabin as a squat, hiding in the crawl space or the surrounding woods, and coming in when renters were asleep or away. He said it was not uncommon in remote areas. People living off the grid, hiding from law enforcement or just society in general, using vacant or rental properties without permission. He said it was dangerous, that we were lucky we were not hurt. He asked if we wanted them to go back to the cabin with us to retrieve anything we had left behind. I said no. We had grabbed everything important. I did not want to go back there. He said they would send a trooper out to investigate and coordinate with the owner. He also said we should contact the rental company for a refund and that we had grounds for a legal complaint if we wanted to pursue it. We drove back to Anchorage in silence. Sarah was shaken, barely speaking. I kept thinking about those footprints at the base of the stairs, about someone standing there in the dark, listening to us sleep, watching us. How long had they been there before I woke up? What were they planning to do? 2 days later, the state trooper called me. They had gone to the cabin and found evidence that someone had been living in the crawl space for weeks, possibly longer. They found more supplies, more trash, and a journal. The journal had dates and notes written in it. Notes about the cabin, about renters who had stayed there, about their routines and schedules. Our names were in it. The dates we had reserved the cabin. Notes about when we arrived and what we did that first night. The trooper said they also found photos. Polaroid photos taken through the windows. Photos of previous renters. Photos of couples sleeping, cooking, showering. The photos were disturbing, voyeuristic. They had been pinned to the wall of the crawlspace like trophies. He said they had evidence of at least 8 different renters being watched and photographed over the past year. They never found the person. The trooper said it looked like whoever it was had left in a hurry after we discovered the sleeping bag. They tracked footprints into the woods, but lost the trail after about a mile. He said the person likely knew the area well and had escaped on foot or had a vehicle stashed somewhere nearby. They put out a bulletin and alerted other law enforcement agencies, but no arrests were made. The cabin owner was cooperative but claimed total ignorance. He said he only came to the property a few times a year, that he lived in Anchorage, and that he rented it out through a management company. He said he had no idea anyone was squatting there. The management company claimed they inspected the property between bookings, but clearly they had missed the signs. The owner agreed to install security cameras and better locks. He also offered us a full refund and a formal apology. Sarah and I broke up a few months later. It was not directly because of the cabin, but the experience changed something between us. She developed severe anxiety. She could not sleep alone. She was terrified of someone breaking into our apartment. She started seeing a therapist, but the fear never really went away. We tried to make it work, but eventually it was too much. I still think about that weekend, about the footprints in the snow, about the man standing at the base of the stairs listening to us breathe, about the photos pinned to the wall in the crawl space, watching us like we were animals in a zoo. The state trooper said he is still out there, probably doing the same thing at another cabin, another property, watching another unsuspecting couple. I hope they catch him. I hope no one else has to go through what we did, but I know the chances are slim. Alaska is too big, too remote, too easy to disappear into, and there are too many cabins, too many places to hide, too many people who think they are alone when they are not. I inherited my grandfather's old trapping cabin in the Brooks Range last year after he passed away. He had owned the property since the 1970s, a small log cabin about 90 miles north of Fairbanks, accessible only by bush plane or snowmobile in winter. My grandfather had been a trapper his whole life, living off the land, fiercely independent, the kind of man who thought civilization was a disease. He spent his winters at that cabin, sometimes going months without seeing another human being. He died in March of last year at home in Fairbanks, and in his will, he left the cabin to me. I'm not a trapper. I work in IT. I live in Seattle. I had visited the cabin exactly twice in my life, both times as a teenager, and I remembered almost nothing about it except that it was cold, isolated, and smelled like wood smoke and animal pelts. But my grandfather had made it clear in his will that he wanted me to have it, that he wanted it to stay in the family. So, in November of last year, I flew up to Alaska to assess the property and decide what to do with it. I hired a bush pilot named Tom to fly me out there. We left Fairbanks on a gray morning when the temperature was hovering around 0. The flight took about an hour, following frozen rivers and jagged mountain ranges, until we reached the cabin. It sat in a small clearing surrounded by dense forest, with a frozen creek running behind it. The cabin looked smaller than I remembered, weathered and dark against the snow. Tom landed on a stretch of flat ground about 100 yards from the cabin, helped me unload my supplies, and said he would be back in 4 days. Then he took off, and I was alone. The cabin was locked, but I had the key. Inside, it was exactly as my grandfather had left it. A single room, with a wood stove, a narrow bed, a table and chair, shelves lined with canned goods and supplies, and traps hanging from the rafters. Everything was covered in a thin layer of dust. There was no electricity, no running water, just a propane lantern and a wood stove for heat. In the corner, on a small wooden shelf, was an old ham radio. I recognized it immediately. My grandfather had used it to communicate with other trappers and occasionally with family. It was his only connection to the outside world. I spent the first day cleaning, organizing, and going through my grandfather's belongings. I found his journals, decades worth of entries documenting his trapping routes, the animals he caught, the weather, and his thoughts. Reading them felt like intruding on something private, but I was curious. The entries were sparse and factual, mostly just dates and numbers. But the final few entries, from the weeks before he left the cabin for the last time, were different. They were rambling, confused, filled with references to voices and warnings. One entry, dated February 18th, just 3 weeks before he died, read, "The radio spoke again tonight. Same voice. Tells me to leave. Tells me they are coming. I do not know who they are. I'm not leaving." I sat there in the dim light of the propane lantern, reading those words over and over. My grandfather had been 79 years old when he wrote that. Maybe he had been experiencing dementia or hallucinations from isolation. It would make sense. But something about the way he wrote it, so matter-of-fact, so certain, made me uneasy. That night, I made dinner on the propane stove, added wood to the fire, and lay down on the narrow bed. The silence was overwhelming. In Seattle, there is always noise. Traffic, people, sirens, something. Out here, there was nothing. Just the wind in the trees and the occasional crackle of the fire. I fell asleep quickly, exhausted from the travel and the cold. I woke up at 3 a.m. to the sound of static. I sat up in bed, disoriented, trying to figure out where the sound was coming from. Then I realized. The radio. The old ham radio in the corner was on, crackling with static, the green power light glowing faintly in the darkness. I stared at it, my heart pounding. I had not turned it on. I had not even touched it. I got out of bed and walked over to the radio slowly. It was an old model, the kind with dials and knobs, powered by a small battery pack. I reached out and turned the volume down, and the static faded to a whisper. Then I turned it off completely. The green light went dark. I stood there for a moment, staring at it, trying to figure out how it had turned on by itself. Maybe a short circuit. Maybe the battery was dying and causing it to malfunction. I went back to bed, but I did not sleep. I lay there, listening, waiting for it to happen again. At 3:47, it did. The static returned, louder this time, filling the cabin. I sat up and looked at the radio. The power light was on again, glowing green, the speaker crackling. Then, through the static, I heard a voice, a man's voice. Faint, distorted, but clear enough to understand. It said my name. It said Lucas. I froze. The voice was not unfamiliar. It sounded like my grandfather. The same rough, gravelly tone, the same cadence. but my grandfather was dead. He had been dead for 8 months. I climbed out of bed and walked over to the radio, my hand shaking. The static continued, the voice cutting in and out. It said, "Lucas, you need to leave. You need to leave now." I stood there, staring at the radio, my mind racing. This was not possible. I checked the dials. The radio was set to a frequency my grandfather had used, but there was no way anyone was transmitting on it. We were 90 miles from the nearest town, in the middle of the wilderness, in the dead of winter. No one else was out here. I grabbed the microphone and pressed the transmit button. I said, "Who is this? How do you know my name?" The static stopped. Complete silence. Then the voice came back, clearer this time, more urgent. It said, "Lucas, this is your grandfather. You are in danger. You need to leave the cabin. They're coming." I dropped the microphone. My whole body went cold. I told myself this was not real. It was a recording, a prank, something my grandfather had set up before he died as some kind of twisted joke. But the voice knew my name. It knew I was there. I picked up the microphone again and said, "Grandpa, is that really you? How is this possible?" The voice responded immediately. It said, "I do not have time to explain. Listen to me. There are things in these woods. I heard them for weeks before I left. They speak through the radio. They use it to find people. I should have destroyed it, but I did not. Now they know you are here. You need to leave before they come." I felt like I was losing my mind. I said, "What things? What are you talking about?" But the voice did not respond. The static returned, louder and more chaotic, and then the radio went silent. The power light flickered and went dark. I stood there in the darkness, breathing hard, my mind spinning. I turned on the propane lantern and searched the cabin for any explanation. I checked the battery pack on the radio. It was dead, completely dead. There was no way the radio could have been transmitting or receiving anything. I did not sleep the rest of that night. I sat at the table with the lantern burning, reading my grandfather's journals, looking for answers. The entries from his final weeks were filled with references to the radio. He wrote about hearing voices, warnings, conversations that made no sense. He wrote about feeling watched, about hearing footsteps outside the cabin at night, about seeing shadows moving between the trees. On February 25th, just days before he left the cabin for the last time, he wrote, "The radio told me what they are. It told me why they come. I do not understand, but I believe it now. I will leave tomorrow. I will not come back." He never explained what the radio told him. The next entry was dated March 2nd, written in Fairbanks. It was just one sentence. "I should have destroyed the radio." At dawn, I went outside to clear my head. The air was brutally cold, maybe 20 below, and the sun was just starting to rise, casting a weak gray light over the snow. I walked around the cabin, looking for tracks, for any sign that someone had been there. I found nothing, just my own footprints from the day before. I stood there, staring out at the forest, and that is when I heard it. A sound in the distance. Faint, rhythmic, like something moving through the trees. I listened, my breath coming out in clouds, but the sound faded and disappeared. I went back inside and spent the rest of the day trying to rationalize what had happened. I convinced myself that the radio had malfunctioned, that the voice was some kind of interference or echo from an old transmission. I told myself my grandfather had been experiencing hallucinations, that his journals were the ramblings of an old man, losing his grip on reality. But deep down, I did not believe it. That night, I unplugged the battery pack from the radio completely and stored it in a box under the bed. I made sure there was no way the radio could turn on. I added wood to the fire, made dinner, and tried to relax. Around 10, I lay down and closed my eyes. I was exhausted mentally and physically, and I fell asleep quickly. I woke up at 3:47. The cabin was freezing. The fire had gone out, and the radio was on. The static was deafening, filling the cabin, crackling and hissing like something alive. The green power light was glowing, impossibly. even though the battery pack was still under the bed. I sat up, my heart pounding, and stared at the radio. The voice came through the static, louder than before, frantic. It said, "Lucas, they are outside. Do not open the door. Do not let them in. They will try to make you open the door." I jumped out of bed and ran to the radio. I grabbed it with both hands and shook it, screaming at it to stop. But the voice kept going. It said, "Listen to me. You need to destroy the radio. Smash it. Burn it. If you do not, they will keep coming. They use it to find you. Destroy it now." And then I heard the knocking. 3 slow, deliberate knocks on the cabin door. I froze. The voice on the radio stopped. The static continued, but the voice was gone. The knocking came again. 3 knocks. Patient. Measured. I did not move. I stood there, staring at the door, every instinct screaming at me not to open it. The knocking came a 3rd time, and then I heard a voice outside. It was my grandfather's voice. It said, "Lucas, open the door. Let me in. I need to tell you something." I knew it was not him. I do not know how I knew, but I knew. My grandfather was dead. Whatever was outside, it was not him. I backed away from the door slowly, my eyes locked on the handle. The knocking stopped. The voice outside stopped. And then the radio spoke again. It said, "Good. Do not open it. Now destroy the radio. Do it now." I grabbed the radio, ripped it off the shelf, and smashed it on the floor. The plastic casing cracked, the speaker shattered, and the green light flickered and died. I picked up the pieces and threw them into the wood stove, then poured lantern fuel on them and lit a match. The flames roared, and the radio burned. I stood there, watching it melt and blacken, and the knocking outside stopped. I did not sleep the rest of that night. I sat by the stove with a knife in my hand, waiting for dawn. When Tom came to pick me up 2 days later, I told him I was ready to leave. I did not explain why. I just said I had made my decision. The cabin was going up for sale. I have not been back. I sold the property to a developer who plans to tear it down and build something new. I do not know if that will help. I do not know if destroying the cabin will end whatever was out there. But I know I will never go back to the Brooks Range, and I know my grandfather was trying to warn me. He heard the same voice, he saw the same things, and he left before it was too late. I was lucky I listened. I have been living off-grid near McCarthy, Alaska for the past 3 years. I moved out here after getting tired of the city, tired of people, tired of the noise and the chaos. I wanted solitude, self-sufficiency, a simpler life. I built a small cabin on 40 acres of land, about 12 miles from the nearest neighbor, accessible only by a rough trail that requires a 4-wheel drive vehicle or a snow machine in winter. I have solar panels for electricity, a well for water, and enough supplies to last me through the long winters. I hunt, I fish, I trap. I do not see many people, and that is exactly how I like it. November is when things get quiet out here. The tourist season ends in September, and by November, most of the part-time residents have left for the winter. The temperature drops, the snow starts piling up, and the roads become impassable. I usually go into McCarthy once a month to pick up mail and supplies, but otherwise, I'm completely alone. I have a satellite phone for emergencies, but I rarely use it. This is the life I chose, and for the most part, it has been exactly what I needed. On November 14th of last year, I was outside splitting firewood when I heard the sound of an engine. I stopped and listened. It was faint at first, but it got louder. Someone was driving up the trail toward my cabin. I was not expecting anyone. I set down the axe and waited. A few minutes later, a white pickup truck appeared through the trees and pulled into my clearing. A man got out. He was in his 40s, maybe 50, wearing khaki pants, a button-down shirt, and a jacket that looked too thin for the weather. He had a clipboard in his hand and a laminated badge hanging from his neck. He smiled and waved as he approached. I did not wave back. I just stood there, waiting for him to explain why he was on my property. He introduced himself as a federal census worker. He said he was going around to remote properties in the area to verify residency and collect demographic information for the 2024 census. He was polite, professional, speaking in that overly friendly tone that government workers use when they are trying to put you at ease. He asked if I had a few minutes to answer some questions. I told him I had already filled out my census form online earlier that year. He said he was doing follow-up verification for properties that were flagged as potentially inaccurate or incomplete. He said it would only take a few minutes. Something felt off. I could not put my finger on it, but my instincts were screaming at me. First, the census had been conducted in 2020, not 2024. Second, it was mid-November. No one does census work in rural Alaska in November. The weather is too unpredictable, and most seasonal roads are already closing. Third, he had no vehicle identification, no government plates, nothing on his truck that indicated he was actually a federal employee. Just a plain white pickup with no markings. I told him I was not interested in answering any questions. He frowned and said it was required by law that I could be fined for refusing to cooperate. I told him I did not care and that he needed to leave my property. His demeanor shifted. The friendly tone disappeared. He said he needed to come inside and verify my living conditions, that it was part of the process. I told him no. He took a step closer, and that is when I saw his boots. They were muddy, caked with dirt and debris, like he had been walking through the woods for a long time. But his truck was clean, no mud on the tires, no dirt on the exterior. That did not make sense. I told him again to leave. He stared at me for a long moment, his jaw clenched, and then he turned and walked back to his truck. But he did not get in. He just stood there, leaning against the driver's side door, watching me. I went back to splitting firewood, keeping one eye on him the entire time. After about 10 minutes, he finally got in his truck and drove away. I watched until he disappeared down the trail, and then I went inside and locked the door. I could not shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe he was legitimate, just poorly trained or working for a contractor. But the more I thought about it, the more wrong it felt. That night, I called my neighbor, a man named Carl, who lived about 12 miles south. I asked if he had received any visits from census workers recently. He said no, and then he told me something that made my blood run cold. Carl said that over the past few months, there had been reports of a man going around to remote properties in the area, claiming to be various types of officials, sometimes a census worker, sometimes a state land surveyor, sometimes a wildlife officer. He would show up unannounced, ask invasive questions, and try to gain entry to homes. In a few cases, he had been aggressive when refused. One woman reported that he had lingered on her property for hours, watching her cabin before finally leaving. Another man said the same person had come to his place twice in the same week, using different stories each time. Carl said the state troopers were aware of the situation but had not been able to identify or locate the man. The properties he targeted were all remote, all off-grid, all occupied by people living alone. Carl told me to be careful, to keep my doors locked, and to call him if the man came back. I thanked him and hung up, my mind racing. I checked all the windows and doors, made sure everything was secured, and kept my rifle within reach. The next day, I went about my usual routine, but I was on edge. Every sound made me jump. Every time I looked out the window, I half expected to see that white truck coming up the trail. Around noon, I decided to check my trail cameras. I have several cameras set up around my property to monitor wildlife and keep an eye on the trail. I pulled the SD cards and brought them inside to review the footage. That is when I saw him. The man had come back. The timestamp showed that he had returned around 2 a.m, driving up the trail with his headlights off. He had parked his truck about a quarter mile from my cabin, out of sight, and walked the rest of the way. The footage showed him circling my cabin, peering in windows, trying door handles. He spent over an hour on my property, just walking around, watching, testing. At one point, he stood at my front door for several minutes, his face inches from the window, staring inside. Then he left, walking back to his truck and driving away. I felt sick. This man had been on my property while I slept, watching me, trying to get inside. I immediately called Carl and told him what I'd found. He told me to call the state troopers right away and to send them the footage. I did. I used my satellite phone to contact the troopers and explain the situation. They said they would send someone out as soon as possible, but it would take at least a day. The nearest trooper post was over 100 miles away. That night, I did not sleep. I sat in my chair with my rifle across my lap, staring at the door, listening to every creak and groan of the cabin. Around midnight, I heard it. The sound of footsteps on my porch. Slow, deliberate footsteps. I stood up, aimed the rifle at the door, and waited. The footsteps stopped. Then I heard the door handle rattle. Someone was trying to open the door. I shouted through the door. I said, "I have a gun. If you do not leave my property right now, I will shoot." The door handle stopped rattling. Silence. I waited, barely breathing. Then I heard the footsteps again, moving off the porch, circling around the side of the cabin. I went to the window and looked out, but it was too dark to see anything. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it out into the darkness. Nothing. Just trees and snow. I spent the next 2 hours like that, moving from window to window, shining the flashlight out into the night, waiting for him to try again. But he did not. Around 2 in the morning, I heard the sound of a truck engine starting in the distance. He was leaving. I waited until I could not hear the engine anymore. Then I checked all the windows and doors again. Everything was still locked, but I found something that made my stomach turn. On the back porch, near the door, there was a piece of paper wedged under a rock. I picked it up and brought it inside. It was a handwritten note. It said, "I know you are alone. I know your schedule. I will be back." That was it. No signature, no explanation, just those 3 sentences. I called Carl immediately, even though it was the middle of the night. He came over at dawn, armed and ready. We searched the property together, looking for any signs of the man. We found footprints in the snow, lots of them, circling the cabin, leading to each window and door. We also found tire tracks where he had parked his truck, about 200 yards from the cabin, hidden in the trees. Carl took photos of everything and told me I needed to leave, at least until the troopers could investigate. I refused. This was my property, my home. I was not going to let some psychopath run me off. The state troopers arrived the next afternoon, 2 of them, both armed, both taking the situation seriously. I showed them the trail camera footage, the note, the footprints. They confirmed that the man matched the description of the person who had been reported at other properties. They said he was suspected of breaking into remote cabins, stealing supplies, and in at least 2 cases, assaulting the occupants. They said he was dangerous, and that I should not stay at the cabin alone until he was caught. I told them I had nowhere else to go and that I was not leaving. They understood but advised me to be extremely careful. They said they would increase patrols in the area and set up surveillance on some of the nearby trails. They took the note and the SD cards as evidence and said they would do everything they could to find him. But Alaska is huge, and there are thousands of miles of wilderness where someone can disappear. They were honest with me. They said the chances of catching him were slim unless he made a mistake. For the next 2 weeks, I was on high alert. I did not go anywhere without my rifle. I installed more cameras, added motion sensor lights around the cabin, and slept with my boots on. Carl checked on me every day, sometimes staying overnight. But the man did not come back, not during those 2 weeks at least. Then, on December 1st, the troopers called me. They had caught him. A woman living near Katina had reported the same white truck parked near her property. The troopers responded and found the man hiding in a shed on her land. He had a duffel bag full of stolen items, tools, food, jewelry, all taken from remote cabins in the area. He also had detailed notes about the properties he had visited, including mine. The notes described my daily routine, what time I woke up, when I left the cabin, where I kept my supplies. He had been planning to come back. The troopers said he was arrested and charged with multiple counts of burglary, trespassing, and attempted assault. His name was not released to me, but they said he had a long criminal history and had been living out of his truck, targeting isolated properties for months. He had been using fake identification and different cover stories to gain access to homes. When that did not work, he would watch and wait, looking for an opportunity to break in. I testified at his trial earlier this year. He was convicted and sentenced to 12 years in prison. But I still do not feel safe. 12 years is not forever. And I know there are others out there like him, people who prey on those of us who live alone in the wilderness. I still check my cameras every day. I still sleep with my rifle. And every time I hear a truck engine in the distance, my heart starts pounding. The wilderness is beautiful, but it is also unforgiving. And sometimes, the most dangerous thing out here is not the cold or the wildlife. It is other people. I rented a hunting cabin near Wrangell-St. Elias National Park last September for a solo moose hunt. I had been planning the trip for over a year, saving up vacation time and money, researching the area, and getting my hunting license and tags in order. The cabin was listed on a hunting forum as an affordable option for hunters who wanted access to good moose territory without breaking the bank. It was remote, about 40 miles from the nearest town, accessible by a rough dirt road that required four-wheel drive. The owner, an older man named Henry, rented it out during hunting season to help cover maintenance costs. The photos online showed a classic Alaskan hunting cabin. Single room, bunk beds, wood stove, a small kitchen area with a propane stove, and a porch overlooking a meadow that backed up to thick forest. Perfect moose habitat. The price was reasonable, $200 for the week, and Henry seemed friendly over email. He said the cabin had been in his family since the 1960s, built by his father and uncle, and that it had hosted hundreds of successful hunts over the decades. He said I would love it. I drove up on September 10th, a Friday afternoon. The weather was perfect, cool but sunny, the kind of early fall weather that makes you feel alive. The drive took longer than expected. The last 20 miles were brutal, but I finally arrived around 4 in the afternoon. The cabin looked exactly like the photos. Rustic, weathered, but solid. Smoke was coming from the chimney. Henry had mentioned he would come out the day before to start a fire and make sure everything was ready. I unloaded my gear, set up my hunting equipment, and spent the evening organizing. The cabin was cozy, the fire was going strong, the wood stove radiating heat, and I cooked a simple dinner on the propane stove. I went to bed early, around 9, excited to get out at dawn and start scouting for moose. I woke up around 2 in the morning to a sound I could not immediately place. It was rhythmic, like breathing, slow, deep breaths, in and out, in and out. I lay there in the bunk, listening, trying to figure out where it was coming from. At first, I thought it was the wind. The cabin was old, and wind can make strange sounds as it moves through cracks and gaps in the walls. But this did not sound like wind. It sounded organic, deliberate, like something alive. I sat up and listened more carefully. The sound was coming from the walls. All around me, the entire cabin seemed to be breathing, the walls expanding and contracting slightly with each breath. I told myself I was imagining it, that it was just the wood settling as the temperature changed, or maybe an animal in the crawl space beneath the cabin. I got up, added more wood to the stove, and went back to bed. The breathing continued, but eventually I fell asleep. The next morning, I woke at dawn and went out hunting. I spent the entire day hiking through the forest, glassing, meadows, looking for signs of moose. It was a good day. I saw fresh tracks, some rubs on trees, and heard a bull calling in the distance. I did not get a shot, but I felt confident. I returned to the cabin around 6 in the evening, exhausted and ready to eat and sleep. I made dinner, stoked the fire, and sat on the porch for a while, watching the sun set over the mountains. The air was crisp, the sky clear, and for a moment, everything felt perfect. Then I went inside, locked the door, and climbed into the bunk. I was asleep within minutes. I woke up again around 2 in the morning. The breathing was back, louder this time, more pronounced. I sat up and looked around the cabin. The fire in the stove had died down to coals, and the room was dim, lit only by the faint glow of the embers. The walls were moving. I could see them. The wooden planks expanding and contracting like lungs, filling and emptying. It was not subtle. It was obvious, undeniable. I got out of bed and walked over to the wall, pressing my hand against it. I could feel it. The wall was warm, warmer than it should have been, and I could feel it moving under my palm, breathing. I pulled my hand back and stepped away, my heart pounding. I told myself this was not possible. Wood does not breathe. Cabins do not breathe. But I could see it. I could feel it. Then I noticed something else. The breathing was synchronized with mine. When I inhaled, the cabin inhaled. When I exhaled, the cabin exhaled. I tested it. I held my breath, and the cabin held its breath. The walls stopped moving. The sound stopped. Complete silence. I let out my breath, and the cabin breathed with me. I felt a wave of panic. I grabbed my flashlight and went outside, standing in the cold night air, trying to calm down. I walked around the cabin, shining my light on the walls, looking for any explanation. Maybe there was an animal trapped inside the walls, or maybe the cabin was built over some kind of geothermal vent that was causing air to move through the structure. But I found nothing. The cabin looked completely normal from the outside. I went back inside, added wood to the fire, and sat at the table trying to rationalize what I had experienced. I was tired. I had been hiking all day. Maybe I was hallucinating, or maybe the altitude was affecting me. I decided to stay awake for a while to see if the breathing would continue. It did. The entire cabin breathed, slow and steady, in perfect rhythm with me. Around 4 a.m, I decided to look through the cabin for any clues. There was a small bookshelf in the corner with some old hunting magazines and a few notebooks. I opened one of the notebooks and found entries from previous hunters who had stayed in the cabin. Most of the entries were mundane. Notes about successful hunts, descriptions of the area, tips for future hunters. But as I flipped through the pages, I found entries that made my blood run cold. One entry, dated September 1998, read, "The cabin breathes at night. I thought I was going crazy, but I can see the walls moving. It is not the wind. It is something else. I am leaving tomorrow." Another entry from October 2003 read, "Do not stay here alone. The cabin watches you. It knows when you are awake. It breathes with you." There were more. Dozens of entries over the years, all describing the same thing. The breathing walls, the synchronized movement, the feeling of being watched. The most disturbing entry was dated September 2011. It read, "I tried to leave, but the cabin would not let me. The door would not open. The windows would not break. I was trapped for 3 days. When it finally let me go, I ran. Do not come back here." I closed the notebook, my hands shaking. I needed to leave. I packed my gear as quickly as I could, threw everything into my truck, and tried to open the door. It would not budge. The latch moved freely, but the door itself felt like it was sealed shut, like the frame had somehow contracted around it. I pulled harder, throwing my weight against it, but it did not move. I went to the windows. They were old, single-pane glass, easy to break. I grabbed a chair and swung it at the nearest window. The chair bounced off. The glass did not crack. I tried again, harder. Nothing. It was like the windows were made of steel. I was trapped. The breathing intensified. The walls began moving more violently, expanding and contracting like lungs struggling for air. The temperature in the cabin dropped suddenly, my breath coming out in thick clouds. I could hear it now, not just the sound of breathing, but something else underneath it. A wheezing, gasping sound, like something struggling to breathe, like something suffocating. I backed into the center of the room, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The walls were closing in, not quickly but noticeably. The cabin was shrinking. I could feel the pressure in my chest, like something was pressing down on me, squeezing the air out of my lungs. I tried to breathe, but it was like the cabin was stealing my air, taking it from me. I dropped to my knees, gasping, clawing at my throat. The walls were so close now, just a few feet away, on all sides. The sound of breathing was deafening, filling my ears, drowning out everything else. I thought I was going to die. I thought the cabin was going to crush me, suffocate me, absorb me into its walls. Then suddenly it stopped. The walls snapped back to their original positions. The door flew open, swinging wide on its hinges. Cold air rushed in, and I could breathe again. I did not hesitate. I crawled out of the cabin, stumbled to my truck, and drove away as fast as I could, not caring about the rough road or the darkness. I made it back to town by dawn and checked into a motel. I spent the next 2 days trying to process what had happened. I called Henry, the cabin owner, and told him everything. He was silent for a long time. Then he said, "You're not the first person to tell me this. I should have warned you." I asked him what the hell was going on. He said the cabin was built using salvaged wood from an old mining structure. In 1934, there was a cave-in at a mine about 30 miles from where the cabin now stands. 11 miners were trapped underground and suffocated over the course of several days. The mine company salvaged what they could and sold the wood cheap. Henry's father bought it and he used it to build the cabin. Henry said people have been reporting the breathing for decades. Some hunters stay the full week and never notice anything. Others, like me, experience it intensely. He said he does not know why it happens, or why it affects some people and not others. He said he has tried to have the cabin blessed, tried to tear it down and rebuild it, but nothing works. The breathing always comes back. I asked him why he still rents it out. He said most people do not experience anything, and the ones who do usually leave without incident. He said he needs the money, that the cabin is all he has left of his father. I told him he was going to get someone killed. He did not respond. I reported the cabin to the local authorities, but there was nothing they could do. The cabin is on private land, and as long as Henry discloses the history to renters, which he does not, he is not breaking any laws. I posted about my experience on the hunting forum, where I found the listing, warning others not to stay there. Some people believed me. Others said I was making it up or that I had altitude sickness. I do not care if people believe me or not. I know what I experienced. I know what I felt. That cabin is alive in some way I cannot explain. It breathes, it watches, and it takes your air when it wants to. I will never go back there. I will never hunt in that area again, and I will never forget the sound of those walls, gasping and wheezing, like something trapped and dying, over and over for nearly a century. My family owns a cabin near Tok, Alaska, about 15 miles off the main highway. We have had the property since the 1980s, and over the years, it has become our winter getaway spot. My parents used to take me and my siblings up there every December for ice fishing and snowmobiling. Now that I'm older and my parents have retired to the lower 48, I try to make it up there at least once a year to check on the place and make sure everything is holding up through the winter. Last December, I drove up from Anchorage to clear snow off the roof and do some basic maintenance. It was a Friday evening when I arrived, the sun already down, temperature hovering around 15 below zero. The cabin looked good from the outside, snow piled high around the foundation, the roof sagging slightly under the weight, but nothing alarming. I unloaded my gear, started a fire in the wood stove, and settled in for the weekend. The cabin is small, just one room, with a loft bedroom, a kitchenette, and a wood stove. It sits on the edge of a frozen lake, surrounded by dense forest on 3 sides. The nearest neighbor is about 8 miles away, a seasonal property that is empty during the winter. I've always loved the isolation. No noise, no people, just the wilderness and the quiet. I spent Friday evening organizing my tools and supplies, making a list of tasks for the weekend. Around 10, I climbed up to the loft and got into bed. The fire was still going strong, and the cabin was warm. I fell asleep quickly, exhausted from the drive. I woke up around 11 to the sound of an engine. I sat up in bed, confused. It sounded like a snowmobile, distant but getting closer. I climbed out of bed and went to the window. The lake was bathed in moonlight, the snow reflecting a pale blue glow. And then I saw them. Headlights. 2 bright beams cutting across the frozen lake, moving toward the cabin. I watched as the lights approached. They moved in a wide circle around the cabin, maybe 100 yards out, then looped back and circled again. I assumed it was someone from town, maybe lost or looking for a place to camp. But something felt off. The lights moved too smoothly, too deliberately, and there was no sound. I could hear the engine when I first woke up, but now, even though the lights were close, I heard nothing. I went downstairs and opened the front door, stepping out onto the porch. The cold hit me immediately, and I could see my breath in thick clouds. The lights were still circling, but now I could see them more clearly. They were not attached to anything. No snowmobile, no vehicle, just 2 beams of light floating above the ice, moving in perfect synchronized circles around the cabin. I stood there, frozen, watching. The lights completed another circle, then stopped directly in front of the cabin, about 50 yards out. They hovered there, pointed at me, blinding and bright. I raised my hand to shield my eyes, and that is when they vanished. Just blinked out like someone had flipped a switch. No fade, no gradual dimming, just gone. I stood on the porch for another few minutes, scanning the lake, looking for any sign of movement or explanation. Nothing. The lake was empty, silent, bathed in moonlight. I went back inside, locked the door, and tried to convince myself I had imagined it. Maybe it was a reflection from the moon, or northern lights, or some kind of atmospheric phenomenon. But I knew what I saw. Those were headlights, and they were circling the cabin. I did not sleep well the rest of that night. I kept getting up to check the windows, expecting to see the lights again. They did not return. At dawn, I bundled up and went outside to investigate. I walked out onto the lake, following the path where the lights had been. The snow was smooth and undisturbed. No tracks, no tire marks, no sign that anything had been there. I spent Saturday doing maintenance on the cabin, trying to stay busy and distract myself from what I had seen. I cleared snow off the roof, checked the propane tanks, repaired a broken shutter. Around 4 in the afternoon, I decided to hike over to the neighbor's cabin to see if they had been up recently. Maybe they had seen something, but when I got there, the place was locked up tight, buried under snow. No one had been there in months. I returned to the cabin as the sun was setting, the temperature dropping fast. I made dinner, stoked the fire, and tried to relax, but I could not shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every time I looked out the window toward the lake, I expected to see those lights again. Around 10 that night, they returned. I heard the engine first, faint and distant, then growing louder. I went to the window and saw them. The same 2 headlights, circling the cabin, moving in that same smooth, deliberate pattern. This time, I grabbed my own headlamp and went outside. I stood on the porch and watched as the lights completed another circle. Then I shouted. I yelled, "Who is out there? What do you want?" The lights stopped. They hovered for a moment, then started moving again. But this time, they were not circling. They were coming straight toward me, fast. I backed up toward the door as the lights approached, growing brighter and brighter. They were maybe 20 feet from the porch when I turned and ran inside, slamming the door behind me and locking it. I stood with my back against the door, my heart pounding, waiting for something to happen. The lights were right outside. I could see them through the window, illuminating the entire interior of the cabin. Then they moved. Slowly, deliberately, they circled the cabin, passing by each window in turn, flooding each room with blinding white light. I followed them, moving from window to window, trying to see what was creating them. But there was nothing. Just the lights. No snowmobile. No machine. No person. Or after what felt like an eternity, the lights moved away, back out onto the lake, and resumed their circling pattern. They stayed there for hours, circling and circling while I sat inside, unable to sleep, unable to look away. Around 3 in the morning, they finally disappeared. The next morning, I decided to do some research. I drove in to talk and stopped at the general store, a place where locals gather and gossip. I asked the owner, an older man named Carl, if he had ever heard of strange lights on the lake near my family's cabin. He stopped what he was doing and looked at me for a long moment. Then he nodded. He said, "You saw them too." Carl told me that locals had been reporting those lights for decades. He said they appear every winter, usually in December and January, always at night, always circling the cabins along the lake. He said no one knows what they are or where they come from. Some people think they're ghosts. Others think they are some kind of natural phenomenon, maybe swamp gas or ball lightning, though neither explanation makes much sense for a frozen lake in Alaska. Then he told me the story. In the winter of 1973, 5 snowmobilers went out on that lake during a whiteout. They were experienced locals, familiar with the area, but the storm was worse than anyone expected. Visibility dropped to 0 and temperatures plunged to 40 below. The group got separated. 2 of them made it back to town. The other 3 disappeared. Search teams looked for weeks, but they never found the bodies or the snowmobiles. The lake ice was too thick to break through, and there were no open leads where they could have fallen in. They just vanished. Carl said the lights started appearing within a few weeks of the disappearance. At first, people thought it was search crews still looking for the missing snowmobilers, but the lights would appear in places where no one was searching, at times when no crews were out. And they never responded to calls or signals. They just circled, endlessly, like they were looking for something. I asked Carl if anyone had ever gotten close to the lights, tried to follow them, or figure out what they were. He said a few people had tried over the years, but the lights always disappeared when approached directly. He said one man, a skeptic who did not believe in ghosts, went out on the lake with a camera and a snowmobile, determined to debunk the whole thing. He followed the lights for over an hour, filming them, chasing them across the ice. His camera stopped working after a few minutes. The battery drained, even though it was fully charged. His snowmobile died shortly after. The engine just quit for no reason. He had to walk back to shore in 30 below temperatures and nearly froze to death. He never went back. Carl said most locals just accept the lights as part of the area now. They do not talk about it much with outsiders, but everyone who lives around that lake has seen them at least once. He said they are harmless, as far as anyone knows, but they are persistent. If you stay at a cabin on that lake in the winter, you will see them. It is just a matter of time. I thanked Carl and drove back to the cabin. I spent the rest of Sunday finishing my maintenance work, but I kept looking out at the lake, half expecting to see the lights even in daylight. They did not appear. That night, my last night at the cabin, I stayed awake. I sat in a chair by the window, watching the lake, waiting. Around 11, the lights returned. This time, I did not go outside. I just watched. They circled the cabin, slow and steady, like they were patrolling. I counted. They circled exactly 12 times, always at the same distance, always at the same speed. Then they stopped, directly in front of the cabin, hovering over the ice. They stayed there for maybe 5 minutes, just sitting there, pointed at the cabin. Then they moved away, out toward the center of the lake, and disappeared. I left early the next morning. I did not tell my parents about the lights. I do not think they would believe me, and honestly, I do not want to scare them. The cabin has been in our family for decades, and it holds a lot of good memories. But I have not been back since. I have made excuses, said I was too busy, or the weather was bad. The truth is, I do not want to see those lights again. I do not know what they are. I do not know if they are the spirits of the missing snowmobilers still searching for their way home, or if they are something else entirely. But I know they are real, and I know they are still out there, circling that lake every winter night, looking for something they will never find. Carl was right. If you stay at a cabin on that lake in the winter, you will see them. And once you do, you will never forget it. I work as a wilderness guide in Alaska, leading hunting and fishing expeditions for clients who want the full remote experience. It is a good job, pays well, and I get to spend most of my time in the backcountry, which is exactly where I want to be. Every January, during the off-season, I use a remote cabin near the Wrangell Mountains as a base camp to resupply and prepare for the upcoming tour season. The cabin belongs to the guiding company I work for, and it is stocked with equipment, food, and supplies that we use throughout the year. Last January, I flew out to the cabin with a bush pilot named Tom to do my annual inventory and resupply run. The plan was simple. I would spend a week at the cabin, assess what we needed, radio Tom with a supply list, and he would fly back out the following week to deliver everything. Then I would organize the supplies, winterize the cabin, and fly back to Anchorage. I had done this same routine for 3 years without any problems. Tom dropped me off on January 5th. The weather was clear, temperature around 0, perfect flying conditions. He helped me unload my gear, confirmed the pickup date for January 12th, and took off. I watched his plane disappear over the mountains, and then I was alone. I spent the first few days going through the cabin systematically. I checked the propane tanks, inspected the equipment, inventoried the food stores, and made notes of what we needed. By January 8th, I had a complete list ready. I radioed Tom on the satellite phone that evening and read him the list. 50 pounds of rice, canned goods, propane canisters, medical supplies, batteries, the usual stuff. Tom said he would place the order with our supplier in Anchorage and fly out on January 12th as planned. I thanked him and signed off. The next morning, January 9th, I woke up to the sound of an airplane. I checked my watch, 6:30 a.m. Way too early for Tom, and we had not scheduled a drop for that day. I got dressed quickly and went outside. A small bush plane was circling the cabin, flying low. It was not Tom's plane. I did not recognize it. I waved, confused, and the plane circled once more before flying off to the north. About an hour later, I heard a thud on the front porch. I opened the door and found 2 large boxes sitting there. They were sealed with packing tape and labeled with my name and the cabin address. I stared at them, completely confused. I had not heard the plane land or take off again. I looked around. No tracks in the snow, no sign that anyone had been there. I brought the boxes inside and opened them. Inside were supplies. Rice, canned goods, propane canisters, medical supplies, batteries. Everything I had ordered. But I had only radioed Tom the night before, and he had not placed the order yet, and the delivery was not supposed to happen until January 12th. This was 3 days early. I checked the boxes more carefully. The items were correct, but the brands were different. I had specifically requested a certain brand of rice that we always used, but this was a generic brand. The canned goods were different labels. The propane canisters were the right size, but a different manufacturer. It was like someone had taken my list and filled it with substitutes. Then I noticed something else. The food containers felt heavier than they should. I opened a can of soup and poured it out. Mixed in with the soup were small electronic devices, tiny black boxes, maybe an inch square, with what looked like antennas. I dumped out more cans. Every single one had these devices hidden inside. I opened the rice bags. Same thing. Little black boxes buried in the rice. My heart started pounding. These were tracking devices. Someone had intercepted my supply order, planted these devices, and delivered them to the cabin. Someone was trying to monitor me. I immediately grabbed the satellite phone and called Tom. I told him what had happened. He said he had not sent any supplies, that he had not even placed the order yet. He asked if I was sure about what I found. I described the boxes, the items, the tracking devices. He was silent for a long moment, then told me not to touch anything else. He said he would contact the authorities and get back to me. I spent the next hour searching the cabin for any other surveillance equipment. I found cameras, 3 of them. Tiny wireless cameras hidden in the rafters, pointed at the main room, the storage area, and the sleeping loft. They had not been there before, I was certain. Someone had planted them recently, probably when they delivered the fake supplies. I disconnected the cameras and smashed them with a hammer. Then I went outside and searched the perimeter of the cabin. I found more cameras hidden in trees pointed at the doors and windows. I destroyed those too. Then I walked a wider circle around the cabin looking for any other signs of intrusion. That is when I found the tracks. Snowmobile tracks leading from the north, circling the cabin, then heading back north. Someone had been here recently. Tom called me back 2 hours later. He had contacted the Alaska State Troopers, and they were taking the situation seriously. He said they suspected this was related to a drug smuggling operation that had been using remote cabins in the area as temporary storage locations. The troopers believed the smugglers were planting surveillance equipment to monitor when cabins were occupied and when they were empty. If a cabin was empty, they would use it to stash drugs or other contraband, then retrieve it later. Tom said the tracking devices I found were likely GPS trackers, used to monitor movement in and out of the cabin. The fake supply drop was a way to plant the devices without raising suspicion. He said the troopers wanted me to leave the cabin immediately, that it was not safe for me to stay. He said he would fly out that afternoon to pick me up, weather permitting. I told him I was not leaving. This was my job, my responsibility. I was not going to let some drug smugglers run me off. Tom argued with me, said I was putting myself at risk, but I was stubborn. I told him to send the troopers instead. I would wait for them. Tom reluctantly agreed. He said the troopers would fly out the next day, January 10th, and that I should stay inside the cabin and avoid going outside unless necessary. I agreed. That night, I did not sleep. I sat in the dark with a rifle across my lap, watching the windows, listening for any sound. Around midnight, I heard snowmobiles, multiple engines approaching from the north. I went to the window and looked out. I could see headlights in the distance moving through the trees, heading toward the cabin. I grabbed the satellite phone and called Tom. No answer. I tried again. Still no answer. The satellite connection was dead. Someone had jammed the signal. The snowmobiles stopped about 100 yards from the cabin. I could see them through the window. 3 machines, 6 men standing around them. They were talking, pointing at the cabin. I could not hear what they were saying, but I knew why they were there. They had been monitoring the cabin, expecting it to be empty, and they realized someone was inside. I turned off all the lights in the cabin and moved away from the windows. I crouched in the corner, rifle ready, waiting. The men approached the cabin slowly, spreading out, surrounding it. I heard footsteps on the porch, then the door handle rattled. They were testing the door. It was locked. Then I heard voices. One of them shouted, "We know you are in there. Come out and we will not hurt you. We just need to use the cabin. Come out now." I did not respond. I stayed silent, hidden in the shadows. They waited for a few minutes. Then I heard breaking glass. They were smashing a window. I aimed the rifle at the broken window and fired a shot into the air above their heads. The sound was deafening in the small cabin. The voices outside stopped. I heard scrambling, boots on the porch, someone shouting. Then the snowmobiles started up and they left. I listened as the engines faded into the distance, then silence. I stayed awake all night, watching, waiting for them to come back. They did not. At dawn, I went outside to assess the damage. The window was smashed, glass everywhere. There were boot prints all over the porch and around the cabin. And there was something else. A small package, wrapped in plastic, sitting on the porch near the door. I did not touch it. I left it there. Tom arrived around noon with 2 state troopers. They secured the area, documented everything, and retrieved the package from the porch. It was drugs. Several pounds of methamphetamine, wrapped tightly in plastic. The troopers said the smugglers had likely intended to stash it in the cabin or nearby, using the cabin as a drop point. When they realized I was there, they tried to intimidate me into leaving. When that did not work, they left the drugs as a threat, a message that they would be back. The troopers collected all the tracking devices, the smashed cameras, and the drugs as evidence. They said this was part of a larger operation they had been investigating for months. Remote cabins across the region were being used as temporary stash houses for drugs being transported across Alaska. The smugglers would monitor the cabins with surveillance equipment, wait until they were empty, then use them to store contraband for short periods before moving it to the next location. The troopers said I was lucky. If I had left the cabin when the smugglers arrived, they would have used it and disappeared before anyone knew. If I had stayed and confronted them directly, things could have ended badly. They said the warning shot likely saved my life, that the smugglers did not want a confrontation with someone armed and willing to defend themselves. Over the next few months, the investigation expanded. The troopers arrested multiple people involved in the smuggling ring, including the pilot who had delivered the fake supplies. They found evidence of dozens of remote cabins being monitored and used as stash houses. The operation had been running for over a year, moving hundreds of pounds of drugs across Alaska. I testified at the trial earlier this year. The people involved were convicted and sentenced to long prison terms. The cabin was cleared of all surveillance equipment and secured, but I have not been back. The company reassigned me to a different base camp, and I was fine with that. I do not want to go back to that cabin, knowing what happened there, knowing that people were watching me, waiting for me to leave so they could use it for their operation. I still think about that night, about the men surrounding the cabin, about the sound of breaking glass, about the choice I made to fire that warning shot. I think about what could have happened if I had not. And I think about all the other remote cabins out there, empty and isolated, being used by people who do not care about the wilderness or the people who live and work in it. Alaska is a beautiful place, but it is also a place where people disappear, where crimes go unnoticed, where the vastness of the land makes it easy to hide. I learned that the hard way. My two friends and I planned an ice fishing trip to Lake Louise last March. We had been talking about it for months, needed a guy's weekend away from work and responsibilities, and the fishing at Lake Louise was supposed to be excellent that time of year. We decided to stay at one of the public-use cabins maintained by the state. They are free, first come, first served, and popular with locals and tourists alike. We figured, even if we did not catch much, it would be a good time. We arrived on a Friday afternoon, March 8th. The drive from Anchorage took about 3 hours, and we pulled up to the cabin around 4. It was a small log structure, maybe 20 by 20 feet, with a wood stove, bunk beds, a table, and not much else. Basic, but clean and functional. There was a logbook on the table where visitors could leave notes about their stay, weather conditions, wildlife sightings, that sort of thing. My name is Jacob, and my two friends are Mike and Chris. We are all in our early 30s, grew up together, and try to do at least one trip like this every year. We unloaded our gear, started a fire in the wood stove, and flipped through the logbook while waiting for the cabin to warm up. Most of the entries were mundane. Great fishing. Saw a moose. Thanks for the shelter. Standard stuff. Then Chris found an entry that made him stop. It was dated February 23rd, just 2 weeks earlier. It read, "Warning, do not stay here. The clock on the mantle will start ticking. When it does, leave immediately. We stayed. We should not have. If it starts counting down, you have less than an hour. Do not wait. Leave." The entry was not signed, and the handwriting was shaky, almost frantic. We all looked at the mantel above the wood stove. There was a clock there, an old wind-up clock, the kind with brass gears and a glass front. It was stopped at 2:47. The second hand was frozen in place. Chris picked it up and examined it. He tried winding it, but the mechanism was jammed or broken. The clock did not work. Mike laughed and said it was probably a prank, someone trying to scare future visitors. Chris agreed. I was not so sure. Something about that entry felt genuine, but I did not want to be the killjoy. We decided to ignore it, make dinner, and enjoy our weekend. We spent the evening cooking, drinking beer, and playing cards. Around 11, we turned in. I took the bunk closest to the door. Mike took the middle, and Chris took the one by the back wall. I woke up around 2 in the morning to a sound. A ticking sound. Steady, rhythmic, mechanical. I sat up in bed and looked around. The sound was coming from the mantel. The clock was ticking. The second hand was moving, sweeping smoothly around the face. The time displayed was wrong, though. It was not showing the current time, it was showing 60 minutes. Exactly 60 minutes. And as I watched, it ticked down to 59 minutes and 59 seconds. I climbed out of bed and walked over to the clock. The ticking was loud now, echoing in the small cabin. I reached out to touch it, and the moment my fingers made contact, the clock face changed. The numbers rearranged themselves, the hands spinning wildly, and then it settled on a new display. 59 minutes, counting down. I pulled my hand back and stared at it. Chris woke up next. He heard the ticking and sat up, groggy and confused. He looked at the clock, then at me and said, "What the hell is that?" I told him I did not know, that the clock had started on its own. Mike woke up a moment later, and the three of us stood there, staring at the clock as it ticked down. 58 minutes, 57 minutes. Mike said we should leave. Chris said we were being ridiculous, that it was just a broken clock malfunctioning. But Mike pulled out the logbook and flipped to that entry again. He read it out loud. "When it starts counting down, you have less than an hour. Do not wait. Leave." He looked at us and said, "We need to go. Now." Chris argued. He said it was the middle of the night, freezing cold, and we had been drinking. Driving in those conditions was dangerous. He said we should wait until morning, that nothing was going to happen. Mike and I were not convinced, but Chris had a point. We debated for a few minutes while the clock kept ticking. 55 minutes. 54 minutes. We decided to compromise. We would pack our gear, load the truck, and be ready to leave if things got weird. But we would wait a bit longer to see what happened. Maybe the clock would just wind down and stop. Maybe nothing would happen at all. We spent the next 20 minutes packing in near silence, the only sound the relentless ticking of the clock. 50 minutes, 49 minutes, 48 minutes. Everything was loaded in the truck except for a few items we left by the door. We sat at the table watching the clock, waiting. At 45 minutes, the temperature in the cabin dropped, suddenly and dramatically. Our breath started coming out in thick clouds, and frost began forming on the inside of the windows. The fire in the wood stove was still going, but it was not producing any heat. The cabin was freezing. At 40 minutes, the door started acting strange. The front door, which we had left slightly ajar for a quick exit, swung shut on its own and locked. Mike tried to open it. The handle turned, but the door would not budge. It was like it had been welded shut. He pulled harder, throwing his weight against it. Nothing. Chris tried the back window. It would not open either. The latch moved freely, but the window was stuck fast. At 35 minutes, the lights went out. We had a battery-powered lantern on the table, and it flickered and died. Our flashlights did the same. The only light in the cabin came from the glow of the fire and the faint luminescence of the clock face. The ticking grew louder, more insistent, filling the cabin with a sound like a heartbeat. At 30 minutes, we heard the voice. It came from outside, muffled and distant, speaking in a language I did not recognize. It sounded old, guttural, like something from a nightmare. The voice was chanting, repeating the same phrases over and over, in rhythm with the ticking of the clock. Chris started panicking. He was pacing back and forth, yelling that we needed to get out, and that we were going to die in here. At 25 minutes, the cabin started shaking. Not violently, but enough to make the walls creak and the floor vibrate. Objects on the shelves began to rattle. The clock remained perfectly still on the mantel, ticking down. 24 minutes, 23 minutes. At 20 minutes, the windows started cracking. Thin spiderweb fractures appeared in the glass, spreading slowly, accompanied by sharp snapping sounds. The voice outside grew louder, more frantic. It was no longer chanting. It was screaming. We could not understand the words, but the emotion was clear. Rage, desperation. Something was outside, and it was furious. At 15 minutes, Mike made a decision. He grabbed the axe we had brought for splitting firewood and started swinging at the door. The blade bit into the wood, but the door did not break. It was like hitting stone. He swung again and again, his blows growing more desperate. Chris joined him, kicking at the door, throwing his shoulder against it. I tried the windows, smashing them with a chair. The glass would not break. It flexed under the impact but held firm. At 10 minutes, the voice stopped. The sudden silence was worse than the screaming. The cabin stopped shaking. The temperature stopped dropping. Everything went still. We stood there, breathing hard, staring at the clock. 10 minutes. 9 minutes. 8 minutes. Then the cabin started closing in. The walls were moving. Slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, but definitely moving. The space inside the cabin was shrinking. The bunks pressed closer to the table. The ceiling lowered. Chris screamed. Mike dropped the axe and started clawing at the door with his bare hands. I looked at the logbook on the table, and that is when I saw it. There were more entries, ones we had missed. Entries from people who had stayed past zero. They were incoherent, rambling, written in shaky handwriting or smudged ink. One entry just said, "It took them. It took them. It took them," over and over for an entire page. At 5 minutes, we made our final decision. We were leaving, no matter what. We gathered at the door, Mike still holding the axe, Chris and I ready to push. We counted down. 3, 2, 1. Mike swung the axe with everything he had, and at the exact moment the blade hit the door flew open. Not slowly. It exploded outward, like something had shoved it from the inside. We ran. We did not grab anything. We just ran. We stumbled through the snow toward the truck, not looking back. Behind us, we could hear it. A sound like the cabin was collapsing, wood splintering, glass shattering, metal groaning. And underneath it all, the ticking of the clock still counting down. 4 minutes. 3 minutes. We reached the truck and piled in. Mike started the engine, threw it into gear, and floored it. We fishtailed down the snowy road, tires spinning, the cabin disappearing behind us. We drove for maybe 5 minutes before Mike slowed down and pulled over. We all sat there, shaking, trying to catch our breath. Chris checked his watch. It was 3:47 in the morning, exactly 1 hour after the clock started. We sat in silence for a long time, none of us wanting to talk about what had just happened. Finally, Mike said we should go back. We should check the cabin, make sure it was still standing, document what we saw. Chris and I both said no, absolutely not. We were not going back, but Mike insisted. He said if we did not go back, no one would believe us. We would sound insane. We needed proof. Against my better judgment, I agreed. Chris reluctantly came along. We drove back slowly, the sun starting to rise over the mountains. When we reached the cabin, we stopped and stared. The cabin was destroyed. Not damaged. Destroyed. The walls had collapsed inward. The roof was caved in, and the entire structure looked like it had been crushed by an invisible hand. We got out of the truck and walked closer. The door was lying in the snow, 20 feet from the cabin. The windows were blown out, glass scattered everywhere. Inside, we could see the remains of the furniture, splintered and broken. And in the center of the wreckage, sitting on a pile of debris, was the clock. Undamaged. Still ticking. The time displayed was 2:47, the same time it had been stopped at when we arrived. Chris picked it up carefully and turned it over. On the back, engraved in tiny letters, were words in a language none of us recognized. We left the clock there. We reported the cabin to the state authorities, told them it had collapsed, possibly due to snow load or structural failure. We did not mention the clock or the countdown. They sent someone out to assess the damage and eventually condemned the site. The cabin was never rebuilt. I looked up the history of that location later. There were reports going back decades of strange occurrences at that cabin. People disappearing. People found dead inside with no clear cause. Rescue teams finding the cabin destroyed with no explanation. The state had rebuilt it multiple times, and each time, something happened. The clock had always been there, left behind by someone. No one knew who. Chris, Mike, and I have not talked about that night since. We made a pact. We would not tell anyone, would not post about it online, would not try to investigate further. We were lucky to get out. Others were not, and that clock is still out there somewhere, counting down, waiting for the next group of people foolish enough to stay.